Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. First of all, I wanted to say welcome. I'm really glad that we have you all here with us today. My name's Elizabeth McMunn-Tatenko, and I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Carolyn Jennings, who's going to be giving our Library Faculty Author Series talk today. The Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members, and we're really pleased to be able to continue it in this online format too right now. If you'd like to be featured in a future Faculty Author Series talk, please let me know. As for today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Jennings here with us as part of the series. Dr. Jennings is an associate professor of philosophy and cognitive science at UC Merced. Her work focuses on the nature of attention and how it affects the mind, for example, through perception, consciousness, and action. Dr. Jennings holds an MA in psychology and a PhD in philosophy, both from Boston University, and was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Antwerp. Her book, The Attending Mind, came out in 2020, and she also has a new book, Mind, Cognition, and Neuroscience, A Philosophical Introduction, which came out this year. We're so happy to have her here with us today, and I'm going to turn this over now to Carolyn.
Awesome. Thanks so much for inviting me for this and for people for coming. I'm really looking forward to some discussion about this book. It came out, as Elizabeth said, in 2020, but the paperback just came out this year, and I actually just got it in the mail last week. And this is a picture of me holding it. An important background point Elizabeth alluded to with her kind of bio of me is that I am an interdisciplinary scholar. So I have a background in both philosophy and psychology, as well as neuroscience. I was in a psychology and fMRI lab at Boston University for several years. So my work does tie in at a theoretical level, background from philosophy, from the behavioral sciences, psychology, and from neuroscience. And I use all of that to explore this topic of attention. So to start out, I thought it might be helpful to think about what attention is and what impact it has on the mind by doing a little activity. A kind of a background joke about attention from this guy, William James, a famous philosopher and psychologist who wrote a book in the 1890s. He said back then that everyone knows what attention is. And that's a joke in the field because there are some contemporary people who work on the topic who argue that there is no such thing as attention. So there's a lot of division about what attention is. So it's funny that he said, everyone knows what it is. But nonetheless, I do think that there is an intuitive sense that we all have of what attention is. And so I'm going to try to tap into that with this short activity. So what I'm going to have you do is a meditation exercise. I think everybody's videos are off anyhow, so I just encourage you to have video off so you feel comfortable during this little meditation exercise. We're going to be contrasting two different forms of meditation. One is called focal or concentration meditation, and the other is called open monitoring meditation. And I'm going to lead you in a 1-minute focused meditation, and then we're going to take a little break, and then I'm going to lead you in a 1-minute open monitoring meditation, and then we'll take a little break and talk about it. And the purpose of this is to get you to see what attention is like and what it does to your experience. So let's start with the first one. So concentration meditation or focused meditation. The purpose of this is to have you focus on something. In this case, I'm going to have you focus on your breath. So what I want you to do during this meditation exercise for 1 minute is just to try to concentrate your mind on your breath. What does it feel like? What does it seem like? Can you tell any changes in temperature on your nostrils? Some people say that they can experience that. Are there other changes to your bodily sensations with your breath? So you're just really focusing on your breath. So you're going to do that for 1 minute. Try to focus on your breath, and then after that, we're going to, in the chat, I want you to tell me what happened to your experience while you were focusing on your breath. Okay, so I'm going to get my little timer out. Before we start this 1 minute, all you need to make sure is that you're in a comfortable position so you can do this for a minute. And before I start the timer, I want us all to take a deep breath in and out together. So please Take a deep breath in and out and start. All right, that was 1 minute. So please use the chat to let me know what you noticed about your experience. What was it like to focus on your breath? Did anything happen to your experience? Was it any different from your experience a moment before? Were there any changes? What did you notice about this exercise? It's actually fine with me if people want to unmute too. I don't know if you have that capacity, but okay, cool. So you might have actually noticed the feeling in your nostrils, maybe because I pointed that out. Someone said in the chat that their experience narrowed, so they became more aware of their body than the moment before, more intentional about the speed of the breath, slowing the breath down. This is also a really good trick for stress. So yes, you can actually control your breath and slow it down. Someone said that it was difficult to focus on the breath because of noises in the background they noticed. Someone said they felt more relaxed, more aware of other aspects of the body. Okay, awesome. So great. So it sounds like everybody got something from this. Okay, so let's switch to the other one, the open monitoring meditation. So this form of meditation, we're going to do the exact same thing. We'll do a 1 minute long meditation. It's fairly straightforward and quick. But in this case, the point of open monitoring is that you're not focused on a single thing. So instead of focusing on your breath, you're trying to just be aware of whatever is around you. Sometimes people talk about this as though you're kind of spreading your attention out over everything, whereas other people talk about it as though they're not attending to anything at all. They're just trying to go with the flow and just be aware of what's happening around them without that really focused concentration. So I want you to do the same thing with this open monitoring meditation. You want to be in a comfortable position and you're just trying to be open to what's around you. We're going to start with a deep breath in and out again so that you are triggered to start, and I will mute myself and then I will unmute and let you know when the minute's up. Okay, so deep breath in and out and start. Okay, that was a minute on open monitoring, and please use the chat again just to talk about what was that experience like for you, and especially how is it different from the focused meditation? Did you notice any differences? Okay, one person said that they became more aware of the stuff around them. Let me see if I can. There we go. More aware of parts of my body and the environment than prior. So in the previous exercise, somebody said that they felt like they were distracted and they weren't focused at all. Someone said they were interested in how many things they could hear: birds, trucks, a dog snoring. I love that. One person said that they felt more anxious, easier to keep the mind clear with the unfocused versus the focused one. Someone else said they were also more aware of sounds. Bird song. Okay, so that's great. And you know, we're on like a campus a little closer to nature when everybody picks up on the bird song. I love that. So one of the things that people often talk about the difference between one and the other is exactly this last comment, that there are things that you didn't notice in the previous exercise that were probably there the whole time that you suddenly became aware of with the open monitoring exercise. And I want to draw out 2 points about that difference. One is that it seems like attention is making a difference to your experience. You could be aware or not aware of something depending on the way you're directing your attention. So this change in attention from being very focused to either very broad or absent made a difference to whether or not you experienced something. So there seems like there's a close connection there. And also the other point is that attention itself seems like it's not a mere spotlight. Many people think of attention as operating like a spotlight, as just enhancing things in a narrow window. But attention also suppresses the surround. So attention both has the role of enhancement and suppression. And so contemporary models of attention actually depict it like a field rather than a spotlight. So there's a field over which attention is enhancing some things and suppressing others. And you can really see that with the contrast between these two, I think, because the act of focusing in the first exercise seems like it suppressed some of the things in the surround. And when you let up on that focus, it allowed those things to come back into the experience. So those are the 2 things I wanted you to kind of to see from that, the tight connection between attention and experience, and the way that attention is more complicated than we often talk about in everyday speech. So I'm going to zoom out for a second and talk about the book as a whole, and then I will zoom back in into a specific part of the book. So I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what's going on in the book as a whole. There are 7 chapters. 5 of them are rich with content. The one I want to focus on is right in the middle. It's on attention and perception. The other chapters cover what is called the philosophical landscape on attention, so background work on attention and the self, as well as mental causation. Attention, perception, and knowledge will be the chapter I'll be focusing on mostly today. Attention, consciousness, and habitual behavior. And then finally, there's a chapter on attention, action, and responsibility. I'm going to go briefly through a little bit about each of these chapters just so you can get a sense of what's happening in the book. So the first contentful chapter, chapter 2, is on the history of attention in philosophy. There are 3 different ways of thinking about attention in the history of philosophy. All of these 3 ways of thinking about attention were present thousands of years ago in philosophy as it was done on the Indian subcontinent, so in Indian philosophy. But interestingly, they arose sequentially in Western philosophy. So at around the same time as you see all of these 3 in Indian philosophy, you only have the practice account in Greek philosophy, for example. And the practice account is the one that you could observe from the outside. So this is what this distracting image is. This is somebody who is maybe telling you that you should be paying attention to a guest. This is the practice account of attention, so that that attention is a practice of attending, for example, to a guest. Later than that, you see what's called the ordering account, which is that there must be some kind of ordering within the mind that is leading to these changes in behavior that allow you to, for example, attend to your guest. And then later than that, you see the contemporary account of attention in Western philosophy and science, the instrument account, which is that attention is the mental instrument that leads to the ordering, that leads to the behavioral output, the practice. And again, there were debates between these different accounts of attention in Indian philosophy much longer ago, but this chapter really focuses on the last 500 years of Western philosophy and the arising of this instrument account. Also in that chapter, it talks about how for most of the history of philosophy, people have focused on the relationship between attention and knowledge, seeing attention as crucial for the development of knowledge, but that in the last 100 years or so, philosophers have been much more focused on the relationship between attention and consciousness. The next chapter, probably the chapter that I'm most known for, is on attention and the self. It is not popular in contemporary philosophy of mind and the sciences to think that there could be a self, especially not a self that has causal powers, that is passé. And so it's really controversial that I'm in this book arguing for the existence of a self as the thing that's directing attention. Basic idea of what that account looks like in my work is that the self is a collection of interests. So it's the collection of all of your interests. When those interests are coming together to modulate your mind, basically to shape your mind. So similar to how fish can come together into a school, that's what this little image is supposed to be. And that school might have additional powers or properties beyond the individual fish. The idea is that when you get this collection of interests operating together in a special way, then it has new powers and properties. And then that's what the self is when it directs attention, in my view. The next chapter, the one I'm going to try to focus on the most today, is on the relationship between attention and perception. My view is that attention provides meaning for perception. It structures perception for the sake of knowledge. I am, I think, the first philosopher to argue that attention is necessary for perception, but a lot of people have talked about the relationship between attention and perception and the relationship between attention and consciousness, which is highly related to these arguments. This cartoon should give you a little bit of a sense of what I mean when I talk about the structure of perception. So when you're focusing on, let's say, typing, writing a paper, then your experience will be structured with that, with those words in the foreground for you. So they're going to be kind of highlighted at the expense of everything else. The butterfly, for example, it's still kind of behind you. You may be dimly aware of it, but you're really focusing on the screen. It's in the center of your experience. And so your experience is structured around the screen. But when the butterfly came into the foreground, then the structure of your experience changed. All of a sudden, your experience is structured around the butterfly. And you can see like her little mind is floating around with the butterfly. So it's as though her mind is completely changed now that she's focused on the butterfly. So the structure of your experience, the idea here is that it's structured in theme and field. The theme is the thing that you're currently the most interested in, and the field is everything else. And then that theme can quickly change, restructuring your experience. So the idea is that attention is necessary for providing that structure, structuring your perceptual experience into theme or focus and everything else. The next chapter argues that nonetheless, we do have conscious experiences without attention. And I focus this argument around the case of habitual behavior and skill. I think in our experience, when we're performing very expert behaviors, such as behaviors that we develop through our skills, that it's possible for us to become so attuned to our environment that we don't need to use attention to organize it. We can just respond to the environment as it's pre-organized for us because of this development of a skill and the habitual behavior. So for example, when you are an expert tennis player like this cartoon, you may respond to a serve without using attention at all, without using that kind of organizational structural work of attention. Chapter 6, the one on attention and responsibility, carries on that point about habitual and skill-based behavior by arguing that there's a special form of action and responsibility for that action that's tied to our skills. So I focus on the case of what I call strategic automaticity, when we strategically enter a period of not using attention, but using these more automatic faculties, and that when we enter into that period, that we can still be held responsible for our behavior while doing this strategic automaticity. but that the form of responsibility will be different than the responsibility we normally discuss in legal and moral forums. So normally people think of attention as being required for responsibility, that if you did something without attention, you couldn't be held responsible for it. This comes up a lot in the discussions on people with ADHD and why they may be held less legally responsible for their behavior, for example. So while I agree with the case of ADHD, I think that that in this special case where we're using our skills to do something, a highly trained behavior, that we may be responsible for basically the skill itself, not for acting with attention. And this has important implications for the legal case of negligence, which is really hard to explain without that. Okay, so zooming in. So I zoomed out. So hopefully you got a little bit of sense of the overall picture of the book. I'm going to zoom in on one of the chapters of the book that I think might be interesting to people who are in the audience. So this is a chapter, again, on attention, perception, and knowledge. And there's a couple of quotes on here. I don't know how easy it is to read, so I'm just going to try to zoom. Try to zoom in. There we go. So the first quote is from William James, that person who was writing in the 1890s. He says, "Without selective interest, experience is an utter chaos. Interest alone gives accent and emphasis, light and shade, background and foreground, intelligible perspective, in a word." James is talking there about attention, and I am in basic agreement with James on this point. So I think attention, selective interest is what organizes perceptual experience. And it's something that he claimed in the 1890s. Okay, and then Gibson, James Gibson says, "The visual world can be described in many ways. Most important of all, it is filled with things which have meaning." Gibson is talking here about how, while many of us think of perception as a passive process where we just receive the objects that are around us passively, the fact that our experience is full of meaning shows us that actually we're much more involved in that process than is commonly thought. Okay, so the problem to be explained in this chapter is that whereas perceptual experience, conscious perception, is structured and holistic, sensory input is not. Again, this problem is not new to me. This is a problem that's been remarked upon for I don't know how long, a long time in philosophy, but that's the problem that I'm trying to address. My argument will be that attention is necessary to bridge from sensory input to conscious perception. So it is attention that provides that structure that makes conscious perception what it is. And the way that the chapter is organized is around different types of structures that could provide that bridge. So I say that to find the bridge between sensory input and conscious perception, we're going to have to accurately identify the required structure or structures. So perception is structured in many different ways. What is the most foundational structure of perception that makes perception what it is, that differentiates it from just mere sensory input? If we can figure that out, then we can figure out whether attention or something else is necessary for that basic structure. Okay, so I'm going to go through some different options. I'm going to start with the one that people in the sciences are probably the most familiar with, which is coming out of the work of psychologist Anne Treisman. Treisman has this really famous experiment where she contrasts what's called feature search with conjunction search. So feature search is this image on the left, or is depicted in the image on the left. In this case, the participant would be shown a screen, let's say, with lots of X's, most of them green, in this case with one red X, and they might be asked to find the red X. And you will hopefully notice that in that search, you don't have to do any work if you're normally color-sighted. That the red X would just pop right out at you. You could add as many green X's as you want, and it wouldn't change the amount of time it took you to find the red X. And that was what she found with that search. She calls it also single feature search. So if you're just looking for one feature, like find the red object, say, then it doesn't take any longer, no matter how many distractors you have. It just pops out. Conjunction search, anyhow, in contrast, which is also feature conjunction search, is when you're asking the person to find a combination of features. So in this case, the red X, you're asking them to find something based on both color and shape. So in this case, there are not only shape distractors, but also color distractors. In this case, to find the red X takes longer for each additional distractor that's on the screen. That was something that Anne Treisman found with her research. So whereas with feature search, it doesn't matter how many distractors you add, it always takes the same amount of time. With feature conjunction search, it takes additional time for each added distractor. And that's a really important difference between these two conditions. What Anne Treisman theorized with what she called her feature integration theory is that feature search is based on that we have separable processing for different features in our mind and our brain, which has been confirmed through neuroscience. So we have a dedicated neural area for the processing of color, and that's separable from the dedicated neural area for the processing of shape. So visual input, sensory input, in the case of vision, first is organized into these separate feature processing areas, color and shape, for example. And so she thinks that maybe the reason this is so fast is that we can rely on a single processing region to give us our answer. Whereas for conjunction search, because those processing areas are separated, the information from them has to be brought back together in order to perform a conjunction search. And so the reason it's slower with each additional distractor is that the information from the two areas has to be brought together for each one to check if it has both of those features. And she argued that attention was doing that work. And there have been many experiments since that time that have confirmed that insight, that it seems like something like attention operating through some common spatial areas is necessary for combining those features into objects. Based on that, what some people think is that attention and perception is doing the work of combining features into objects for us. Now, you could stop there and you could say, okay, great, attention is necessary for perception because it's necessary to combine features into objects. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. And Anne Treisman knew that at the time. She said that actually attention is only important for accurately combining features of a certain type into new objects. When you're familiar with an object, you don't need attention to do that work anymore. The features get combined automatically. So when you're in familiar environments, you don't need attention to combine features into objects. And you could also just combine features into objects with happenstance. And some of them might turn out to be right. So you can actually have perceptual experiences without attention, even perceptual experiences of objects. And Anne Treisman knew that. So you couldn't use this to argue that attention is necessary for perception. And a lot of our perceptual experience goes beyond objects. You could experience the blue sky outside with no objects in it, and that is a perceptual experience, even though there's no single object. So it doesn't seem like that is really the foundational structure of perception either, although it is a perceptual structure that is closely tied to attention. Another possibility, another way you might think of how perception is structured that's different from the sensory input is in terms of spatial framework. Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that attention transforms the perceptual field. And he thought one of the ways it does that is that it provides a common spatial framework for sensory input. And I like to think of this game that you play when you're a kid, where you draw, when somebody draws on your back and you try to figure out what exactly they're drawing. Maurice Merleau-Ponty had a different example using somebody who had some brain damage. But if you can remember back to what it was like to do this as a child, you might remember that it's really hard to tell when someone's drawing on your back. You have to really pay attention in order to process the shape. And that has to do with how sensitive our back is. But Merleau-Ponty's idea was that maybe although we can detect sensations on our body, for example, without attention, and so they must be located in some kind of space, that attention allows us to create this common spatial framework, which makes it really clear where exactly in space those sensations are. Okay, the problem with that is that both attention and perceptual experience can happen outside of an objective spatial framework. If you think of Where's Waldo, for example, you could search for Waldo and Where's Waldo, if you know what Where's Waldo is, hopefully you do. So just this guy with Waldo is a guy that wears this red and white striped shirt. You could search for him in a complicated image, just looking for red and white stripes, basically. That would be what we call feature-based attention. You could do that without knowing where Waldo is. That's the whole point. You're looking for the location of Waldo. And you might, for a moment, even feel like you are aware of Waldo, that you've seen him, but you might not yet know exactly where he is. So feature-based attention, like that example, doesn't rely on a common spatial framework. It's searching for features regardless of spatial location. So we know that attention can come apart from spatial framework. So it can't be that attention is primarily providing spatial framework, even if that's one of the things it does. And we know that perceptual experience can happen outside of spatial frameworks. So when you walk into a house, for example, and you smell cookies or baked bread, you might not have a sense of where that smell is coming from, but you've perceived the smell of cookies. So that is a perceptual experience that isn't tied to a spatial framework. So it doesn't seem likely, even though space and perception are closely tied together, it doesn't seem likely that a spatial framework is going to be the fundamental form of organization for perception that makes it distinctive. Merleau-Ponty says that attention presupposes a transformation of the mental field. And one of the ideas I propose in the chapter is maybe it is transforming the mental field, but just not in terms of this kind of physical space. Another idea out there is that maybe it transforms the mental field in terms of what's called the space of reasons. Maybe it allows sensory input to be connected to our beliefs and our reasons, our faculty of reason. This work comes from, for example, philosophers John Campbell and Imogen Dickey. They argue that attention is necessary for demonstrative reference, that is, to refer to something. What John Campbell says is you can't gain knowledge about something unless you can separate it from the things around it, unless you can refer to it. That's demonstrative reference. And he thinks that you can't refer to something in your perceptual space without attention. So you have to be able to highlight it at the expense of everything else. And then Imogen Dickey adds to that and says that you need attention for non-lucky knowledge, that maybe you could happen to refer to something, but that to be sure you've referred to the thing you think you referred to, you need attention. So for example, in this image, I don't know how well you can see this, but you might notice that there's like a Waldo popping up in different parts of the image. The first time you notice it, you might not be sure if that's Waldo. You may have like a sense that there's kind of something funny going on. It seems like it might be Waldo. If you've seen that, and Dickey's point is just that if you thought to yourself, well, I believe that was Waldo that popped up, but you weren't using attention to detect that, that would be like a lucky form of knowledge. But for knowledge, you really need it to be non-lucky. You need to have confirmed it, and thus you need attention. The problem with their arguments, I say in the chapter, is that they're based on Treisman's work. So unfortunately, both of these philosophers assume that you can only combine features into objects with attention. So they're relying on a specific interpretation of Treisman that I've already said is not correct. And Treisman herself said wasn't correct. So the reason they think attention is necessary for reference is they think attention is necessary for combining these features into objects, but attention is not required for that. So unfortunately, I don't think that their arguments work, even though I agree with their conclusion. So I offer a different argument in the chapter. I realize I'm running a little over time, so I'm going to try to give a quick version of that argument. So in my view, subject-based organization requires attention, and it is the thing that's characteristic of conscious perception. Subject-based organization is a thing I talked about when I was giving that zoomed out overview. The most basic foundational perceptual structure, I'm arguing, is according to our own interests, theme and field. So when you a normal perceptual experience, or actually I'm arguing in all perceptual experience, your perceptual experience is organized into something that is more important to you and other things that are less important to you. But that's just how your experience is presented to you, is in terms of a theme and a field. And that it always is organized in that way. So I think that that's the most basic, the most foundational perceptual structure. And I call that subject-based organization because it's organized according to your interests. So differentiating sensory input according to your interests just is the job of attention. And so that makes attention necessary for perception. So if that is the fundamental structure of perception, the only thing that can do that work is attention. There are other selection mechanisms, but they are not mechanisms that refer to your interests. So the only candidate for that work is going to be attention. This will result in perception being informational for us, I argue. So another way of putting this point is that perception is definitionally informational and meaningful, unlike sensory input. And that the way you get to something being informational or meaningful is to connect it with our own interests, and that it is attention that's providing that transformation. Attention can also organize parts of the field into objects, help support the objective spatial framework, improve our knowledge systems, etc. But those are other forms of structures that are not the most foundational structure, I think. I think the most important job of attention and perception is to bring the world to us via our interests. So it connects this kind of raw input with us by connecting it to our interests. Okay, last couple of ideas. This is to connect it to the subsequent chapter on consciousness. You might wonder, well, what happens outside of this field of attention? So you've got attention doing this work of organizing the field into things that are more important and things that are less important. What happens if you're not doing that organizational work at all? Are those experiences utter chaos, as William James thought? And I actually don't think that they're utter chaos. And that's partly because of something I call conscious entrainment. I think you don't need attention for fixed interests in stable environments. So that kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier with, if you have a highly skilled behavior, you don't need attention any longer to organize the space in order to perform that behavior. And in that case, we experience and respond to the world without actively organizing it. Something you might not be happy with accepting, another kind of controversial stance of mine, is that in that case, you are having a sensory experience, but it's not a perceptual one. So I argue that attention is necessary for perception, the organization of space into theme and field, for example. But I think it's possible to have sensory experiences that are not organized in that way when we are perfectly attuned with the world. I think that's going to be a rare experience, but I think it's a possible one. Okay. So if you're interested in some of the ideas I had, I would love to hear your comments and questions. I'm looking forward to discussion, but I wanted also just to mention that I have 5 versions of the paperback that were sent to me by the publisher, and I'm happy to distribute those to anybody who would want one. Just send me an email. It'll be like first come, first serve. So I will give 5 free copies of the book to whoever wants. You just send me an email. All right, thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. And I'm seeing it looks like folks are starting to put some questions in the chat, which is awesome because I was about to try to prompt people to do that. So I can read the questions and then feel free to add more if you have other questions too. So this one says, thanks for this interesting talk. Janardhan Ganeri in 2013 makes Buddha Gosha, I may be saying that wrong, attentionalist, and gave an account of perception, which is not possible with attention, Sita-Bhoga and Ekagata. Do you see attentionalist perception in Indian philosophy?
Yeah, good question. So I'm not familiar with Ganeri's 2013 work, but I did read his Attention Not Self book, and I wrote a commentary on it. So Ganeri, as a little bit of background, so Janardhan Ganeri and I have actually very similar overall views. He actually thinks that we have the same view, even though he thinks that there's no self, and I think attention is evidence of a self. So even though it sounds really different, he thinks that it ends up being the same thing. I disagree, but that just shows you how close we are. So in his view, some of the ways that Western philosophers and scientists have discussed attention, such as through voluntary versus involuntary attention, that we should replace those with some of the more ancient Indian concepts of attention, like ekagata. And he makes a case for that in his book and why that might help us with some of the some different phenomena that he raises. He sees attention as I understood it from his Attention Not Self book, he sees attention as central to consciousness and conscious experience. So he sees attention as doing a lot of the work in creating experience and organizing experience. So I'm actually not aware of his work on thinking that there is perception without attention at all. Even ekagata, in his later work in the Attention Not Self view, he sees as a form of attention. So I'd have to hear more, I think, to know how exactly to respond to that. But yeah, I don't know if that helps at all to see how my work is related to his.
Can I please say something more? So okay, that is interesting, because that you are arguing self within attention, and Ganeri argues attention without self. So interestingly, there is a 11th century philosopher, Abhinav Gupta, who has self and attention, both of them. So I am just exploring him in an attentionalist manner. So maybe your work would help me, I think so.
Okay.
So I'm talking about Abhinav Gupta, an 11th or 12th century philosopher.
Okay, cool. Well, I'd love to hear more about that if you want to send me an email or something. And it sounds like I could learn something from you as well. So
Thanks.
cool.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm seeing another question. It says, could you gloss the case of the tennis player returning a serve? Does the player have merely sensory experience of the ball, but doesn't perceive the ball nor attend to the ball? If the player doesn't perceive the ball and it's only sensory experience, then how does she know where to swing her racket? Is the ball organized for her in space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, so the way to think about, if in this kind of rare case where there's going to be if we're thinking of a case where there's like no attention at all, like a pure, what I call pure conscious entrainment, then the way that I'm thinking that happens is that I'll contrast it first with a case of attention. So in the case of attention, you've got sensory input coming in, and then attention is organizing it according to the things that are more or less important to you, according to your full set of interests. And then your behavioral response is coming out of that organizational work. So you're going to respond based on what is taken to be the most important and most possible thing for you. In contrast, in the case of like a highly skilled behavior, you don't need that middleman to do that organizational work. So instead, the sensory input is automatically organized by your brain into responses. So you have like a direct connection between a specific sensory input and a specific response. And attention doesn't have to weigh like what is the most important response for this input, because you've had that type of input come so many times that it's immediately matched to the output. The way they talk about this sometimes is with like they call stimulus outcome pairings versus stimulus response pairings. That's how they talk about it in behavioral science. In brain science, they talk about it in terms of, are you using your prefrontal cortex versus are you just using your striatum that has these like more automated connections? So yeah, so the idea is that you're at the experiential level, you're having a sensory experience that isn't organized in terms of theme and field, but at the kind of processing level, there's also a difference that the processing is without this weighing of what's more or less important to you. It's just like a kind of direct connection. I don't know if that helps to clarify. Exactly. Yeah. So a good contrast, I should have said this in the talk. Attention is automaticity and attention are really important contrasts. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm seeing another question saying, tethering back to a quote from William James, he claimed attention was driven by special interests. Are we to conceive of these special interests as emotions and desires?
Yeah, good question. So the interests are never defined by James, I believe, and also, unfortunately, they're not defined by me. So even though I depend on them very deeply in my work, I also don't really talk very much about what exactly they are. And that's sometimes feedback I get from people is they're like, well, what are interests and what can be an interest? That's something that I should definitely work on at some point. But I'll usually give examples. Like, so you have something that could be an interest would be basically anything that you're drawn by, anything in your desire set. So you may be interested in ramen, you may be interested in records, you may be interested in bright things or fast things or loud things. There's a wide range of things that are going to draw you. And all of those, I think, count as interests. And so when it's the work of attention, I think, is to, on the basis of your full set of interests, determine how that sensory input should be ranked, basically.
Thank you. I'm seeing another question that says, what are the implications of being in this non-perceptual state? Nishida makes reference to this, wherein the artist, upon achieving mastery, becomes unconscious while she is working.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So with a lot of a point of contrast between me and a number of other philosophers is it has become common in philosophy of mind to refer to these highly entrained states as unconscious. And people even will sometimes say, like, when you're driving in autopilot, when you're in autopilot mode, that's definitionally unconscious. Some people have said that. And one of my more prominent papers, I've argued that there's no reason to conclude that. So I use my own personal examples, but also reports that are published about people who are highly skilled to talk about these strange experiences that are unlike their normal perceptual experiences when they're doing a highly skilled task. And I think it's more reasonable to think that the effect of losing attention or being very highly entrained causes a change in the structure of your experience rather than that your experience goes away altogether. So an example is there's a cellist who there's a report in Journal of Neuroscience talking about this very highly skilled cellist who plays one of the most difficult pieces in his entire career for an international audience, and then says afterwards he doesn't remember what he was doing during that piece. And the classic approach would be to say that was because he was not conscious while he was playing. But my approach is to say that his memory was affected by being in this different state, that he was playing so automatically and so attuned in such an attuned way that even if he was having the experience, that his memory systems weren't activated. You see something very similar in the case of dreaming. So in dreaming, your attention systems are not active, and we tend to forget dreams as soon as we wake up, in part because of that. And I think that while your experiences during these highly skilled states have a very different structure that can impact memory, that shouldn't lead us to conclude that there was no consciousness there at all. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm seeing a follow-up to the tennis question. Can conscious entrainment then be thought of as requiring lesser or different neuronal resources? Or what might the underlying mechanisms be that distinguish between perception with attention and conscious experience without attention?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the conscious part is tricky. The processing part would just be this. One of the ways that I separate attention from non-attention is what I call prefrontal feedback. That's somewhat common lingo in the field. So the prefrontal cortex is this area of the brain that is thought to be domain general. It's not specific to one sensory modality. It's not specific to motor response. It kind of manages all the different parts of the brain. So it's domain general. And prefrontal cortex is very closely connected with attention, and they call it prefrontal feedback when that part of the brain sends signals to other part of the brain, basically. So what I've argued is that it's only attention if there's prefrontal feedback involved, and that's not an uncommon view of attention. So when it's a case of performing without attention, it's going to be a case where you're not getting that prefrontal feedback. And like I said before, that could be because your striatum is managing the connections between stimulus and response, which wouldn't require the prefrontal cortex. You can get stimulus and response without the frontal cortex at all through this subcortical area. I feel like I didn't answer the question though. Oh, but the experience, like how does that, so that's just at the processing level. And the question is like, how do you distinguish like an experiential state? And I don't have a full answer to what it would look like. Why would it be, what would make the difference between experience and not? What I say in the book is that I think that the difference comes down to whether the subject is involved, that I think of the subject as at the heart of conscious experience. And so in the case of attention, the subject is doing the work of organizing input, and the subject isn't doing that work in the case of these special entrainment experiences. But how do you tell whether or not the subject is present? In that other case, I'm not sure. Great question, though.
Thank you. I actually had a question too. I was thinking about the feature-based and conjunction-based searches. And I was wondering, do you have any idea why we would have evolved to have that and have these kind of differences and how we notice things and kind of process things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, one reason that I can think of is just that evolution is messy. And so maybe you have some cells that detect light, and then you're going to have some kind of nerve cells that respond to that. And then you're going to have some other cells that detect sound and other nerve cells that respond to that. And so I think some of the grouping is just because it was a messy, organic kind of bottom up process and not an organized process. And so it kind of starts from that messiness and then kind of tries to, I think, organize on top of that. But yeah, that's a good question. Like, why is it separated? I guess it's one of the things that I sometimes think about is like, how else could it work? Because you couldn't like take in everything about the world at once. It wouldn't be possible to be sensitive to everything. So you kind of have to be sensitive to some aspects and not others. And if you're going to do that, it makes sense to each of the things you're sensitive to, it makes sense to process those individually and then bring that back together. I guess what's surprising is that it's ever brought back together, but that seems really important for action because we're limited, our bodies are limited. So we also can't respond. There's like, we can't take in everything. We can't respond to everything. So there's gotta be a funnel somewhere. Yeah. I don't know. Do you have any more thoughts about that? Or do you have more behind that question that I didn't respond to?
I didn't. I was just trying to kind of think about why that would fit together. So that's really interesting. Yeah. So for now, I'm not seeing any other questions, although that doesn't mean that somebody's not typing in a really long one. But thank you so much. I thought this was so interesting. Thank you for being part of the talk. And thank you to everybody for coming today.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing some other comments too saying thank you again.
Yeah, I appreciate it, everyone. And send me an email if you want a book, and I'm happy to give you one. And send me an email also just if you want to continue the conversation.
Well, thank you so much.